right, why don't we get started? Welcome to the second in our three-part Decoding Democracy series. The topic of today's conversation is Who Do We Think We Are?, in which we will dig into the relationship between Americans' perceptions of the country's demographics and our views about democratic norms, practices, and policies. I'm Andrew Seligson, president of Public Agenda. One program note, I'm in a place that our internet is a little bit questionable today, so if I go in and out, I apologize for that in advance. Thank you all for joining us. We are very pleased as Public Agenda to host this conversation. We contribute to the renewal of democracy in America by bringing research to people who can use it, amplifying unheard voices, and enabling action grounded in the best available evidence. As a 501c3 nonprofit organization, we are scrupulously nonpartisan. Our work is grounded in a set of values and always focused on the North Star of a democracy in which every American counts equally. On the brink of baseball's opening day, I am reminded of the old ballpark vendor's adage that you can't tell the players if you haven't got a scorecard. So let me walk us through who you'll be hearing from in this hour and how that will take place. In a few moments, I will introduce Andrew Thompson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and Andrew will share original research he conducted with support from Public Agenda. I will then be joined by Liliana Mason of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University and Kimberly Serrano of the American Immigration Council, and we will explore the implications of Andrew's research, including for the practical work of bringing Americans together in pursuit of a healthier democracy. Finally, we'll invite the whole group back to take questions from all of you who are participating. We'll collect questions through the chat function in Zoom, and you should feel free to put questions in the chat at any point, and we'll bring them to our panelists in that last section. Before we jump in, I wanted to just say a few words about why we believed Andrew Thompson's research was worth supporting and why we wanted to have this conversation today. Through our Democracy Renewal Project, Public Agenda supported research that answered the following question: how can we simultaneously build access to elections and trust in elections? That question mattered to us because access to and trust in elections are non-negotiable building blocks of a healthy democracy, and because both have been threatened in recent years. Protecting access requires understanding why people are motivated to restrict access. Professor Thompson made the case to us, based on his own and other prior research, that perceptions of who is in the country have a great deal to do with attitudes toward ballot access restrictions, even when those perceptions are themselves mistaken. It may sound provocative and even accusatory to suggest that one's views about individual rights would be based on one's perceptions of how many members of various racial and ethnic groups are in the country, and of course it is troubling. It is also not new, and for much of American history, and to some extent now again, it's the sort of thing people routinely said out loud in public. And I just wanted to cite one example of that for context. So most Americans are familiar with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of the US Supreme Court. We learn about it in history class as the infamous 1896 decision upholding a Louisiana statute segregating rail cars, and it gave the green light for decades of legal segregation until it was, that is to say, the Plessy decision was overturned in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The decision in the Plessy case was 8-1, and the lone dissenter was John Marshall Harlan, who argued that the constitutional amendments passed immediately after the Civil War made it unconstitutional to regulate the actions of people based on their race. Harlan is remembered as a judge with progressive views on race, and in many ways that's true. But in his dissent in Plessy, Harlan also said this: the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty. But in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. From a legal standpoint, Harlan's argument against segregation is simply that the Constitution forbids it. But his rhetoric adds something else: the idea that white Americans should embrace legal equality because it is the best way to ensure white people's dominance in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. It was, in other words, okay to accept the legal equality of Black Americans as a way of maintaining the practical superiority of white Americans. In some respects, our conversation this hour is about how Americans today think about the same relationship Harlan was writing about, the relationship between the relative power of racial and ethnic groups in America on the one hand, and the rights members of those groups should be afforded on the other. And to get us started, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Thompson of the University of Pennsylvania to share his research.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks everyone for coming. I am just going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me one moment. Okay. So yeah, I just want to say thank you again for public agendas support for this work, and then also, I mean, for all of you for making the time. And I'm sure you're busy and I'm sure tumultuous schedules right now as well, to come here and participate. I also just want to give a quick shout out. I was listening to Lily's podcast earlier today, which was as we were just talking about before we started. It was uplifting in the sense that I felt like solidarity in the ideas that she was putting forth. We can get to a lot of that sort of stuff later, but it connects pretty well to what I'm going to be discussing today in the realm of my work, and then I'll sort of end on some future-looking notes. Okay, the title of this talk today is The Big Flip. This is the title of my book project as well, or my book. It's with Oxford University Press. Racial demographic change in the future of American democracy. I'm gonna focus on both of these components, but I really just want to highlight from the start the future component of this, because it'll consistently come out within this discussion moving forward. And this is a project that is deeply about the ways in which people perceive, misperceive, and sort of project ideas of the future onto politics. Okay, so to start, racial demographic change, kind of on its whole, over the past 2 decades, really, following from namely the 2010 census and the sort of like projections that came out from that, but also just in the sort of like storied history of U.S. racial politics, has really become even more salient within recent years. And the particular area that we're going to give attention to here is these ideas of the majority minority flip, or sort of idea, like the ways in which the public conceives of what is a moment in time that at one point was projected as like 2045. And it varies in different ways. The number itself doesn't really matter of the year, but rather the idea is what matters, of the moment in which white Americans are projected to be outnumbered by people of color. So what I end up advancing as an idea within this work, kind of all together, is that what it drives home is this idea of demographic determinism, and I'm going to define that for you, and then kind of reflect on this definition. So this is effectively the perception from Americans that as people of color increase in size and white Americans decrease, there's this projection, this assumption, inference, that the Democratic Party will be at an increasing and insurmountable advantage in electoral politics over the Republican Party. Now, I want to be very clear about this. What I'm saying here is that these are anticipations. I'm not saying in any capacity that this is some sort of prediction on my behalf or anyone else's. And I'm going to reflect on this really like often. I do this in my class as well. If anybody's feeding you any kind of like story about how the future of politics look, they're selling you snake oil, because we don't know what the future looks like, is basically the major point here. But despite not knowing, it's deeply important that we take into consideration how people think about how the future may look to them, amidst other things, because of the fact that, as I'm about to articulate, this not only affects how they think of themselves, and not only affects how they think about other people, but it also affects how they think about American democracy on the whole. So I find this distinctly across the American public. A series of studies that I've conducted, just sort of like priming, activating ideas of the diversification of the country, elicit these ideas and sort of sentiments that as the country is changing, Democrats are sort of slated or seen as being advantaged. This is built off of what I articulate as a series of misperceptions. So embedded within that definition I just gave you, there are three very specific components here that I'm going to just flesh out for a moment. And right after this, after I give you a full overview, but this what this does, not to bury the lead here, is that it ultimately changes the ways in which Americans think about democracy. So they here, namely like those who are perceiving themselves to be at a loss on a partisan level, at a racial level, view themselves to be, or then sort of move in the direction of becoming less supportive of the system of democracy, of a set of democratic norms. They're more willing to engage in political violence, or at the very least support that of others who are acting on their behalf, because of the fact that they perceive their party, namely, to be unable to win into the future, and by extension, their sort of ideas of themselves and being unable to advance their own status. This I basically summarize as a kind of like zero-sum evaluation of what the future looks like in this partisan context, but this partisan racial context. And then I pose this as a question, as just like a sort of thought experiment. But basically, it's this notion of how do you think folks might feel about a system that requires majorities to win, when in fact they perceive, when they're projecting that they would lose the majority. So what I'm basically saying is there's a logic here, despite it not necessarily being like cohering to like the immediate reality, or really just like being an uncertainty that lends itself to being, at the very least, kind of like intimating toward something that's anti-democratic. Okay, so what are these three components of demographic determinism? I define them as the three Ps. So the first is prediction, which is the thing I've already kind of articulated. It's that we can't predict what the future of race looks like. The examples that I give abound. Like, I think if you're just to go over the 20th century, even the idea of what whiteness is, and what Andrew was even articulating, Plessy v. Ferguson, like what was deemed as white in 1896 was not what was deemed as sort of white in 1996. Irish were incorporated at one point, Italians. The whole idea of the kind of cornucopia of race as it exists within the US has socially adapted because it's a moving target. It is a social construct. There's a groundedness to it, meaning that it's not necessarily untrue that people feel things about race. But what I'm basically getting at here is that there's no natural law as it relates to predicting what the future of things look like. The second P that's pertinent to demographic determinism is POC, or people of color. And what I'm getting at here, particularly, and I'll show you this in a moment, of a study that I've conducted, and then also something extending beyond that, conducted with support from Public Agenda on this, is that when Americans think of people of color, they make inferences about who people of color are and how they're operating, and they particularly overestimate ideas of Black Americans. So they're effectively projecting that Black Americans, amidst other people of color, are increasing sort of exponentially in size. And what this ends up doing, as I articulate in a variety of ways, is that this also then feeds into partisanship. So the relationship here between these last two components is really crucial. There's a storied, in light of the civil rights movement, connection between Black Americans and the Democratic Party. And what I'm advancing here is that there's a kind of projection or anticipation that people of color on the whole, either because of this over anticipation of Black Americans, or the association of people of color, kind of on the whole with these initial stereotypes of Black Americans, are then being projected onto the idea that they're going to identify more consistently as Democrats. We may be able to get to this in discussion, but there's a sort of essentialized component here that I think is really worth highlighting, which is to say that when people of color are thought of in this way of identifying, there's the projection or anticipation that they're going to identify as people of color suggests that like other Americans are perceiving them as not being swayed or swayable, that like they're being born into this sort of political attitude, which it's all of these things work together. That's not necessarily a tethered or like a deep component of this, but it's important. So what I'm reiterating here within these 2 points are about prediction, the first P. We don't know how American society will change. Prediction about social or political phenomena is a bunk practice. We barely have a sense, and this is really like deeply important. We really do have we don't have a sense of how weather is bound to change a few days out. Like anything beyond 5 days when it comes to predicting weather, for a variety of reasons, is just like you can't. And so, yeah, to anticipate that by 2045 or something along those lines, that we know what things are going to look like is with all these moving parts. Just yeah, it's anti-scientific, which I'll reiterate at the end. But again, regardless of how we think about this, it's not something that we should just shy away from when it comes to how we discuss this, how we engage with this in the mass American public, because it motivates, as I'm about to show, anti-democratic attitudes. So the first of these is just a sort of graph that I've used in a series of studies where I've just activated ideas of people of color as increasing in size. So this is one of the treatments, the conditions within this study. And what I basically do is I show respondents this, I show Americans this, and then just ask like, which people of color do you think to be increasing in size? And this relative to a more sort of diverse graph where I'm describing a series of the particular people of color. So in this case, like Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, that this one elicits not only a heightened response along the lines of anticipations of Black Americans, but then also this actually elicits a greater reaction in support of political violence among those same Americans. What we've found in recent times is that simply reframing and rearticulating this idea of this misperception that Black Americans are not in fact increasing in size does well to, and this was in 2024, this was right before the election we conducted the study, assuage those concerns and particularize concerns about like what we ended up finding was like increases in sort of views that are like emboldening or like strengthening support for the Voting Rights Act in sort of strong ways, and then also just kind of on the whole perceptions of discrimination or support of these ideas of discrimination among these, in this case, what we may perceive as like formerly threatened Americans. And so moving to the kind of like conclusion, the end point of this project, I'm intimating here about support for political violence, anti-democratic attitudes, but on the partisanship front, what we end up finding very particularly, very consistently is, I'll walk you through this. There, another series of studies we've conducted, we reframe the majority minority flip as either explicitly advantaging, quote unquote, or like anticipatory. We're not even saying like, this is what the future looks like, but rather this is what folks are talking about, things of the sort. That the majority minority flip may advantage either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party based upon the sort of voting trends in the current moment. And what we end up finding very consistently is among Republicans, their anti-democratic attitudes sort of snap to the roughly same levels of Democrats' sort of articulated anti-democratic attitudes when they learn that the party would be advantaged. And so the really crucial part of this is there's an element here of just that zero-sum evaluation that's factoring into anti-democratic attitudes. So at the very least, I'm not offering in this case a solution, which is to say like, oh yeah, if you have a campaign on how people of color identify more as Republicans, that Republicans may be less expressively anti-democratic. That's not necessarily the case, but what I am saying is that there's a crucial dimension here of partisanship that is being sort of lumped into this overall idea of the country racially changing, and that untethering that ends up actually assuaging some of these initial concerns. I don't include this here because I want to be brief, but what this also does is it increases along those Republican advantage lines, Republican support for a series of ideas of racial discrimination toward people of color, Black Americans, meaning that they become significantly more supportive along those lines. And same with, I mean, even ranging as far as warmth toward BLM. And so just to kind of conclude, along these three P's. Really importantly here, when thinking about racial threat from the changing demography of the country, we need to consider how these things function now and not sort of project them into the future, which this in and of itself, relative to that prediction component, it's an anti-scientific practice. But the idea here, when it comes to sort of racial threat, and consistently found within my project, is that it's a salient idea. It motivates anti-democratic attitudes. And it's not limited, though, to extremist sort of oriented Americans. But the really crucial component here is that it's not fixed. It's not something that is necessarily sticky. That it is in fact movable. Folks are either misperceiving or misanticipating, or really are just not privy to the conversation about how, in fact, the country may change, or that they may have a series of sort of interconnected misperceptions that are, let's say, fueled by social media, which presents a bit of a pathway for us forward, which is sort of like the answer of like the question of what may be able to be done along these sorts of lines of racial threat motivating anti-democratic attitudes. I mean, first, and this is just an important dimension here, just a carefulness with the ways in which we engage and talk about the future of the country, because it's by simply talking about these anticipations, what I'm getting at is that they move how people think deeply about democracy, which then feed into these ideas of it being sort of deterministic. And there's even evidence within some of my own work that, like, because folks feel on there to be a kind of set path, they express these sort of existential concerns about the future and about their sort of relative position. And the last point, and this extends far beyond the scope of like this work itself, and it's much more on a normative line. But for all of us, we possess agency within politics. And that's one of the reasons why there's uncertainty here. Like, as I mentioned from the onset, we're not on any sort of set path. And part of the reason behind that is the fact that by virtue of actually just talking with one another, we affect and shift each other's attitudes. And so the really important thing I think to internalize, and this like I said, extends beyond my own work and thinking about this, is that reinforcing these ideas of agency, of the lack of knowledge about the future, but really the component of we bear influence on the world, may be another really crucial, important sort of pathway to bolstering the ways in which people feel and support the idea and the system of democracy. So I'll just end there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. And it's now my pleasure to welcome in Kimberly Serrano, who is the director of the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the American Immigration Council, and Liliana Mason, associate professor of political science in the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And Kimberly, I want to start with you. Andrew, shared kind of two dimensions of the sort of demography as destiny, the idea that we know for sure that there's this growing share of the population that is people of color. He pointed out that that's not really a thing we can know, but also that we know for sure that, or people imagine they know for sure that people of color will be Democrats and that the Democratic Party will grow sort of necessity as the people of color population grows. And I'm wondering in your work, in your practical work, first of all, you feel free to tell us as much as you want about that work for context, but also you're just wondering how those ideas show up and shape what you see happening out there with communities that you're seeking to work with and to connect and to kind of, build bridges, lower the temperature in various respects. Yeah, how do those ideas kind of become relevant in your work?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Andrew, and the Public Agenda team for the invitation to be here today and to be in this conversation, and to everybody who's taken time to join the call. In the work that I'm engaged in at the American Immigration Council, at the Center for Inclusion and Belonging, we're thinking about how do we redefine who belongs in these lands and in these places that we all call home to be as expansive as possible. And so I think some of the kinds of insights that Dr. Thompson is surfacing are really important for the ways that we think about belonging and some of the big stories that are being told about who fits in these lands. And it makes me think a lot of Dr. Arlie Hochschild's work around sort of the deep story and the kinds of narratives that help all of us as people make meaning in these kinds of moments. And for a long time, this sort of demography as destiny story is one that has been told that sort of transcends party. And I think about in some of the ways that I see in practice that has shaped even just a lot of the ways that the parties interact with people in this country and sort of think about and try to understand opinion in ways that often really flattens and decomplexifies what are really, really complex identities. And so I just really appreciate the way that Dr. Thompson's research is kind of tugging at that and adding in some complexity and some nuance to help us kind of understand that identity and ideology are actually not always the same thing, and they don't always sort of map neatly and sort of nicely on top of each other, and that folks in this country have increasingly complex views, and so I think part of what I'm seeing is that actually introduces some different kinds of calculations that community leaders, nonprofit leaders, need to calibrate as they organize, including increasingly interacting across difference. And this is something that I'm seeing happening a lot across the country, is folks beginning to figure out, how do we connect around different shared components of ourselves and our identities that are sort of less driven by these kind of big identity categories of race or background or gender, and be able to kind of get to those places of shared connection and shared humanity. And so glad to sort of tug at any of those threads, as well as any part of the question, Andrew, that I may not have answered, but glad to sort of continue the conversation in that way.
It looks like Andrew might be
Possible that,
frozen.
yes, I think that is true. Oh, there we go. Okay, I think I just clicked back in after disappearing, so I do apologize for that. Yeah, maybe, Kimberly, maybe one piece of that, if you could just maybe give a little bit more kind of color to some of that practical work that you were just describing, that would be terrific.
Sure. So I'll give an example. One of the things I've seen are different groups coming together. There's actually a series of community leaders that we've been working with at the Center for Inclusion and Belonging over the last couple of years, who are running different kinds of community programs, community gardens, literacy clubs, knitting clubs, that are being intentional at the local level about bringing folks together in community from different backgrounds, including different immigration statuses, different racial backgrounds. I'm thinking of some fantastic work, for example, in Detroit, in the Hamtramck neighborhood, where Global Detroit has been bringing folks together who are new immigrants from Africa with longstanding African-American communities in Detroit, and beginning to engage in sort of different kinds of ways of connecting and complexifying experiences around identity, and doing that within a local context. And it's something that we're sort of seeing over time begins to result in different kinds of prejudice reduction, but also deeper connection and a deeper sense of belonging, and that sense of mattering and being able to belong in place with others. And in many ways, it sort of feels really simple. It's kind of getting back to the basics of what it is to be in community together and to sort of relearn that kind of relationship. But it really makes me think of what you spoke about at the top, Andrew, around trust. And the different kinds of ways that trust really is that oxygen of relationship. And I think about that trust that is then also transfers to the oxygen in relationship with our governance, and with the kind of institutions that touch lives at the local level. The extent to which that gets buoyed in local community, we really see begin to have some very positive implications for how people are feeling about their local government and engaged civically.
Terrific. Lily, want to shift over to maybe a sort of, I think Andrew's work in some ways invites us to think in more sophisticated ways about identity categories related to race. And, I want to invite you maybe to do the same thing for identity categories around partisanship. So obviously, much of your work has been in recent years studying the things that are stressing kind of our democratic system and kind of bringing in anti-democratic elements into kind of more normal everyday experience. But I know part of what you've been doing is seeking to understand the diversity in perspectives among people who identify as Republicans. And I wonder what that story has to do with this story from your perspective. And yeah, how it can help us think through that kind of these various shifting identity categories and their relationship.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be part of this. Um, so I think so first of all, from like a political science perspective, I think this is like a fascinating project because what we try to sort of traditionally think of as like the relationship between race and partisanship is that like we have this racial identity and that informs our partisan identity. Um, or we have attitudes about racial equality that informs our partisan identity. And I think what Andrew Thompson is saying here is that like even now we're starting to see that those political identities might actually be starting to affect our racial attitudes. So that's a really interesting development, and I think it's like very new for political science. When it comes to this divide within the Republican Party, I think one thing that is a very clear consequence of this research is, and I don't think it should be understated, is there's a real danger in these attitudes about sort of political determinism, right? And particularly partisan racial determinism, because the most extreme version of this is a conspiracy theory called replacement theory, that was really pushed by, Tucker Carlson, made it very, very popular and broad, but it started off in like really extreme corners of the internet. And now, of course, we see Elon Musk, spreading it on the, whatever news, cable news. Basically, the theory is that Democrats are intentionally importing immigrants into the United States to turn them into Democratic voters so that they can steal elections. And not only is it an incorrect conspiracy theory, but it's actually very dangerous. And there have been multiple mass shooters who have been inspired by replacement theory. So it's not consequence free, right? These misperceptions are deeply, deeply important. And one thing that I've been looking at in my research is that there's a real divide within the Republican Party along matters of racial equality, trust in government, and even this conspiracy theory about replacement theory. That there are basically, about 2/3 of Republicans that are willing to believe this type of thing, and then there's about a third that are still very much opposed to messaging that is rooted in racism and sexism, to these types of conspiracy theories. And obviously a third of the party is not enough to control outcomes of primaries, but certainly a third of a party can change the outcome of a general election. And so I think we should keep in mind as we hear these results that it's not just a misperception of the future, right? It is, in some ways, it's a deeply anti-democratic message itself, that there is this racial conspiracy theory going on that's trying to change our politics. And that message, not only is it, as we're seeing in the results, not only is it increasing anti-democratic attitudes, but it is itself somewhat of an anti-democratic theory. And so this is a really crucial, I think, finding, and it's a really important research agenda.
Kimberly, maybe if I turn back to you with some of that in mind, and if you think about this sort of the possibility that people who agree about a lot of things may shift their views about some of these things. And I think this is part of what your work is about. What's the texture of that shift? What are the ways that people move from a position of fear, et cetera, to a position where they want to work to be in positive relationships with people with whom they, in practice, share a country?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, Andrew. I really appreciate this, like thinking about the future and the good reminders that Dr. Thompson was giving us that like none of us can predict it because of the fact that we are all influencing it. Which makes me think of a boss of mine used to say that when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. And I think I just appreciate this like invitation that his research offers to check our assumptions about, sort of about the direction of the future. And it's something that I find I have to check my assumptions a lot about who supports issues that I work closely on of immigration. And what I find often in research is that there's this sort of perception that people are sort of either anti-immigrant or pro-immigrant, that there's these sort of two very like black and white camps. And in fact, what we find when we talk to folks is that there's a lot of gray, and actually most people are sort of somewhere all over the spectrum. And often when we talk to folks, we hear that in the way that they'll talk about things. They'll in one breath articulate some hesitation around an immigration policy, and then in the next breath express deep love and affection for a friend or a family member, a neighbor who is an immigrant. And so it's this really interesting thing that we do as humans, in that we hold conflicting ideas often at the same time, until something forces us to engage with that and lean into that cognitive dissonance, which is uncomfortable, and try to resolve it. And because it is uncomfortable, we often don't engage it. We'll often just sit and hold those sort of conflicting things at the same time. And what I've seen through work that I've been a part of in deep canvassing, in different kinds of bridge building work in community, as well as extensive audience research, is that often when folks are approached non-judgmentally with a lot of curiosity and given some space to kind of work through their conflictedness, they actually come out on the other side in support of people and feeling more resolved and more consistent in some of their attitudes around different kinds of issues. And so it's actually something that gives me a lot of hope and possibility about the future, is that we see folks are really willing to embrace people and engage more thoughtfully around policies and issues, especially when there's that space from a non-judgmental lens to be able to engage and interact with it.
Lily, what do we know? I know that in some ways your own work has moved kind of in the negative direction in its area of focus, from sort of polarization to these darker phenomena of political violence. And as you described, things that had been very much on the fringe in American political life, kind of moving in this toward the center. And I'm wondering what you know, or what your thoughts are about essentially, in some ways, what Kimberly's just talking about, reversing the direction of travel in those ways, or where there are, yeah, kind of things to grab onto in what you've learned in your research, for example, about the diversity of opinion among Republicans, for example, that suggest, yeah, kind of ways of growing adherence to democratic norms, et cetera.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is that leadership is really important. And so one of the issues that we have, I think, right now is that the messages that people are receiving from their leaders are sort of, particularly from the Republican Party right now, the leadership is sort of making this worse, right? They're focusing their supporters' attention on racial division rather than on, so the potential for future coalition building or whatever. Like the 2012 autopsy report that the Republican Party did was supposed to be sort of this like cross-racial coalition building project. And of course it was immediately turned over. And the next election, Trump was elected. So there is this need, I think, for leaders to have a more responsible role in trying to facilitate this kind of this more collaborative approach. In the absence of that, because often these leaders are not speaking responsibly, and there's no way for us to force them to. It's also important, I think, for us to think about how individuals can also kind of help reinforce this sort of, this is one nation, we're all in this together. Ultimately, people who are on one side 100 years ago are on the other side now, and there's no way to fully determine what the political reality is, and it's changing, it's evolving. We as Americans are changing and evolving, And so to the extent that there's irresponsible messaging coming from leadership, to have individual people who might be leaders in their own communities or just influential voices for whatever reason. And that can be from anybody who is, it can be from like an elementary school teacher all the way up to, local news people, just anybody who has a voice. I think individually we have responsibilities to start speaking about the things that we have in common across these racial lines, and especially because of this of Andrew's research showing that this sort of the we can have Republicans who agree with Democrats on sort of how committed we are to democracy, as long as they're not being constantly told that racial diversity hurts them, and that message when it's being repeated coming out of the Republican Party's leadership, it does work to have people from within the party speak out against that and provide an option for people who don't feel comfortable with this rhetoric or don't feel comfortable believing these things, to give them a separate place to hear an option for understanding the world. And that, to me, right now, this divide exists in the Republican Party. It's currently difficult because of the things you talked about earlier, where these dark kind of more violent impulses that are coming out of the American electorate. A lot of people are afraid to turn against their party, right? It as not only can it be a threat to someone's political career if they're an elected official, or even any sort of career that is involved with politics. It's difficult to speak out, especially against the Trump administration right now. But it's also difficult in the sense that a lot of these people, local elected officials and local political leaders have been receiving a lot more sort of death threats and really frightening messages when they do step out of line. And so that it creates this incentive for everyone to get directly into line. And I think that one thing we should remember is that to the extent that people step out of line, it's actually healthy for democracy. And it's important to have these competing voices coming especially out from the right.
That also, I mean, I think it puts into relief, I think one of the things that Andrew's research is so useful for, right, is reminding us both that part of the reason you can't predict the future is that it's quite contingent. And that's also true about the present in many ways. And the fact that, the Republican Party used to be the party that was much more pro-immigration than the Democratic Party. There certainly are many examples throughout our history of Democrats in various places, particularly like urban machines and whatever, acting in all kinds of anti-democratic ways. There's nothing inherent in the link between party and these views, either toward race or toward democratic norms, et cetera. And I do think, like, for us as a nonprofit organization, nonpartisan organization, it's awkward to talk about partisanship, but I think it makes it easier when you recognize that these connections are quite shifting, and that what we're seeking is not for one party or another to win elections, but for more people to be committed to democratic norms such that those have kind of long-term sustainability. I will invite Emily Sandusky to rejoin us here on the lit up part of the screen. And Emily brings with her your questions that you've submitted thus far, comments, etc., that she can share. And I would also, again, encourage folks, if you have questions that you'd like us to put to the panelists at this point, including Andrew Thompson, who has rejoined us, then please just put those in the chat and we will pull them out and share them. So Emily, what have you got for us?
Let's start with a kind of clarifying and extending question around your work, Andrew. We had a member of the audience ask about how, you talked about the ways that misperceptions focused on the share of Black Americans in the population changing is, associated with anti-democratic policies. But I'm wondering about misperceptions or around the growing share of Latino, Latinx Americans. Could maybe talk a little bit about how you measured that association kind of in your survey experiments and what you found.
Yeah. So a number of points on this. Some of which are, I think, well, as I've been told, are surprising. I find them surprising, and apparently so do other folks. The first one is pretty theoretical, and it's that what I'm basically saying is there are a set of stereotypes about racial minorities that are connected deeply to Black Americans that are then extended onto other racial groups. And so these are like ideas of hardworking, or like in this case, like not being hardworking, being lazy, violent, the connectedness of just like Black Americans in light of basically the reaction to the civil rights movement in crime, that are then sort of imported onto, in this case, like ideas of Latinos. What I'm basically saying is like when people think about like Latino, Latinx immigration, they're engaging with like an association across these, and in a way that not only like basically when you activate attitudes about Black Americans, it spills over onto other groups, and then vice versa. That the elicitation of ideas of like not only immigrant groups but Latinos then have just sort of deeply, immediately anti-Black components to them. The other thing that I didn't include within this, but like extending beyond perceptions, is that on the ground changes matter to this work as well, meaning that there's a kind of interaction or just sort of combination between the ways that like eliciting these ideas work with local demographic changes. And so thinking across, in this case, like the four major racial groups in the country: white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, per the census. What I've found consistently, and this is over now 5 studies, over the span of like 4 years now, is among those local changes, white decline and Black increase are the two sort of local dynamics that when you elicit or when you call to just the idea of the country changing, that they then elicit, namely violent reactions among white Americans that are living there. There are sort of what I'm basically getting at is like, it's not a uniform reaction to Latinos. And I think part of that might be regional. I think part of that might just be the fact that, again, on the racial group component of this, what we're talking about is like a very large sort of imposed upon group that we are assuming there to be not only uniform identity or just like a connectedness of identity, but that also Americans across, the 400 million people that live here think similarly. Emily, the other thing I wanted to add here was just in reaction to Woody's earlier comment. So really briefly and probably depressingly, I've rerun these series of studies, and there's a stability within Republicans' anti-democratic reactions to ideas of the country changing, such that like it's not only eliciting, and this is after 2024, like this is actually after the inauguration. I conducted this in late January. But the major point of this that I think lends itself to a lot of what we're describing here is when it comes to checking our assumptions, what Kimberly had mentioned earlier. Another really important assumption along these lines is that people will update because of how the changes of politics, like because of any given change of politics and like information that they're consuming in like an immediate logical way. And what I'm basically saying there is they're resting on their laurels. Some people are, when it comes to their hunches about politics, but also their senses of threat that are more deeply historically and culturally embedded than they are like looking out into the world and saying, oh, this is how things are and this is how they're going to continue to be, which is it's altogether it makes it deeply more like solidified in being anti-democratic.
Observation from an audience member earlier in the talk, early in your talk, Andrew, about in the context of demography not being deterministic, and someone said, kind of noting that especially as people of color increasingly abandon kind of partisan identity altogether. So I was wondering, kind of, Kim and Lily, you can chime in here too, kind of thinking about, on one hand, we have evidence that perceptions and kind of partisan assumption and partisan identity kind of get intertwined. And then we also have a set of efforts and kind of reform work in the pro-democracy movement that's about kind of trying to address polarization by decreasing the salience of party. Some of that's in primary elections. Kimberly, you talked about identifying other identity characteristics. So like, I know it's a big question, but I'm wondering about how we think about the ways that efforts to kind of lower the temperature on partisanship might play into these kind of trends, expectations, community efforts, kind of in whatever way you want to address. So Kim and Lily, I'd love to hear kind of where you see that bundle of thoughts.
Kim, you want to go first? Okay. So I mean, I'm aware of a lot of these efforts to try to turn down the temperature, and often they're exercises in sort of putting people together and then figuring out, more of like A, what they have in common, and B, teaching them to be curious about each other rather than automatically making assumptions about the motivations and thoughts of the people on the other side. I think another thing that's related, I think, to Andrew's work is that there also are very huge misperceptions of, with it, like each party thinks that the other party is more extreme than it is, and also is much more made up of groups that are characteristic of the party, but aren't actually the majority of the party. And so a lot of these, I think a lot of these exercises they're well-intentioned and they work, right? I mean, they actually are effective for the people that are engaging in them. The thing that I worry about is that, I mean, I guess I'm going to come back to leadership again, right? It's that in order for this type of intervention to work, we need to have a more conducive environment for people to hear these messages. And there's a huge number of people who don't want to hear these messages, right? They are not interested in learning about, understanding the motivations of people on the other side. And they're not interested in thinking of the humanity of the people that they disagree with. And a lot of their leaders are not encouraging them to do that either. So there's a real, I think, incentive problem. I theoretically, yes, it could, right? Like trying to mitigate the effects of partisanship could work, but I'll give you one example, right? So one thing that we know from the social psychology research that can reduce group identity and intergroup animosity is having some sort of superordinate threat. So like a threat to both groups that makes them all realize that they're in this together and that they have to work together to confront the threat. And before 2020, I used to say that like maybe like the Earth will be invaded by aliens and like Democrats and Republicans will have to work together to like defend. But I think COVID was that. Like COVID was kind of the Earth being invaded by aliens, and we were all under the same exact threat. And what we saw was our political leadership actually used it to divide us even more. So it was an opportunity, I think, for us to respond to a superordinate threat as a unified people. And instead, what happened is we started fighting about masks and shutdowns and the things that we were required to work together to do. But we found our political leadership, dividing us even further. So to the extent that there are opportunities to cut across partisanship, those are great, and we should take advantage of them. But it's not going to work unless we have our leaders that are sort of agreeing that these are cross-cutting identities that can really unite us across the divide.
I'm so glad you went first, Lily, because now I have like 13 thoughts in 13 directions, but I'll just offer one of them, which is, Emily, I think this question, we really need to think about it in the context of media and information environments, because so much of these kind of perceptions, misperceptions that we're talking about, they're stories. They're ways that our brains make meaning of things that we don't understand, and of the kind of uncertainty that just is inherent in the future, and it's part of how our brains are wired. And so to the extent to which we're thinking about the kinds of narratives, like the kinds of big stories that are being told and amplified and repeated, and are there alternative stories? So, I'm using the fantastic example of, that Dr. Thompson has given us, right, like embedded in this demography as destiny is the sort of sets of assumptions that like white folks are going to be worse off in a sort of majority minority situation, or that Republicans will be worse off if there are more Democratic votes, right? Like there's these sets of assumptions, and that's because part of how we've been telling these zero-sum stories. What would it look like for a future building story that really looks at like, actually, maybe we'll all be better off right? Like as the country complexifies demographically, maybe that will let us live into these democratic values in a way we haven't yet been able to do, or even more fully. So it just opens up some different kinds of imagination, I think, when we're able to begin to think about what are the stories that are being told, and how, what are some of the roles of those incentive structures that really shrink down to things like partisanship as like a signal. For, if someone has an R next to their name on a voter card, they're going to hold these 19 sets of beliefs. Or if someone checks this box on the census, that they're going to associate with these 17 other beliefs. And increasingly, we find that not to be the case. So the kinds of storytelling that we can do that really lets us as people live into that, I think, is a really, really important part of the calculation.
Would you like to kind of have a final question for the group, or shall we reach to another audience question? We're getting right to the end of our time.
I just saw the question that Alex Levitt just put in the chat, which is essentially why aren't we seeing a rapid kind of recalibration of this based on the widespread reporting on the increase in Latino voting for Republicans this year? And would we know about it already? Is it possible that it's just not yet in the data? And this is kind of a lightning round, I think, as we have just a couple minutes, but I'm interested if anybody has thoughts about that, Andrew, Lily, and anybody's got a data informed or a hunch about that would be interesting.
I'll jump in on this. So to start, there's a number of things here. So what I want to start with are the caveats when it comes to like actually empirically getting a sense of what this is. In competitive elections, it's very difficult to make assertions about whether people are reacting to the opposition or if in fact they are supporting the party that they're voting for. So what I'm getting at is this may not be an endorsement necessarily of the GOP so much as it is like a referendum on Democrats and the incumbent party. That's the first thing. Second thing, I'll just give you an example. And this is, so Enrique Tarrio is one of the leaders of the Proud Boys. He's Hispanic American. The major thing that I want to emphasize here when it comes to even thinking about race is like the Proud Boys are a very clearly white supremacist group. This suggests either a shifting identity or in fact the actual idea, and I think that this is pretty well supported within some of my own work, and honestly just on a historical level of there being a alignment between Republican identity among some individuals and white supremacist ideology in such a way that it's viewed as like being a either elevated status or like something that they're hearkening toward. So what I'm getting at there is it's not even kind of what Lily was referring to earlier of there being an alignment and a molding of racial identity through one's partisan identification could very well be a bit of what is going on there. And yeah, it's it complicates the story even more because what we're suggesting is like knowing even less about how people are identifying. But yeah, those are a number of like potential explanations.
We're getting to the end of our time to thank Kimberly and Lily and Andrew and all of you for attending. And a kind of like personal learning and bit of thanks is thinking about our work at Public Agenda. A lot of research is about understanding categories and using them to understand the ways that people operate in the world, especially kind of public opinions research, kind of research around communications. And I'm finding it very refreshing and kind of sobering on my end to do the work of checking my own assumptions of how I understand categories, how kind of I interpret our findings in light of categories, kind of in the recognition that we are all prey to some of these kind of big, powerful stories about changes in demographics and partisanship. So I'm feeling kind of really grateful for your time and that kind of reflection and how it can help us to do even better work in support of a resilient democracy. I'll hand it over to Andrew for the very last word.
Yeah, which is just to thank everybody for being here and to let you know that we'll be doing this again on May 6th. We'll be talking about whether your rights depend on where you happen to live in the United States of America. And spoiler alert, to a far too great extent, they do. So we hope you'll join us for that conversation. And again, thank you all for being here.